My half-brother lived rent-free in my house for 1 year, but when his pregnant girlfriend tried to kick me out of my own home, I showed them who the real owner was and exposed them all. I'm 29 years old, work in administration for a logistics company, and honestly, I need to tell this story because there are still people in my family who think I'm the bad guy here. What happened with my half-brother Ethan basically taught me that sometimes family is the first to take advantage of your goodwill, and that saying no doesn't make you a bad person, even though they make you feel like one. I guess I should start at the beginning, or like, when my mom died about 5 years ago. My mom passed away from cancer when I was 24, and it was horrible. You know, one of those things that completely changes your life. She left me the family house in her will, a 3-bedroom house in a pretty good neighborhood, nothing fancy, but definitely comfortable. My dad had died when I was a kid, like I was around 7 years old, and my mom remarried when I was 11. From that marriage, Ethan was born, who's now 27, so like 2 years younger than me. The thing is that my mom and his dad got divorced when Ethan was around 14, and since then Ethan basically lived between his dad's house and ours, although he spent more time with us because, well, his dad wasn't exactly father of the year, let's say. Ethan and I always had a more or less normal sibling relationship. We weren't super close, but we didn't fight that much either. The problem is that Ethan was never one of those people who, how do I say it, have their life together. Since he got out of high school, he's had like 1,000 different jobs. None of them last more than 6 months because there's always some problem. It's always the boss's fault or his coworkers or the circumstances, never his responsibility. My mom always defended him, said he just needed to find his thing, that he was going to mature, but I saw the pattern clearly and knew that Ethan was one of those people who just don't want to put effort into anything. After my mom died, I stayed living in the house because, well, it was mine, and also I needed a place to process all the grief and loss. The first few months were really hard, honestly, being in that house full of memories, but it was also comforting in a way. Ethan came to visit me occasionally, always with some dramatic story about his life, about how his girlfriend had left him or how he'd been unfairly fired from his job at an electronics store or whatever it was at that moment. Fast forward, like 2 years after Mom's death. By then, I was more or less emotionally stable. Had my job, my routines, had converted one of the bedrooms into an office and used the other one as a guest room. One day, Ethan calls me all desperate, like almost crying, telling me he'd been evicted from his apartment because he hadn't paid rent in 3 months. He told me this whole story about how he'd had unexpected expenses and his job didn't pay him enough and blah blah blah, the usual excuses. He asked me if he could stay with me just for a couple weeks, a month max, until he got a job and saved up money for a new place. And this is where I admit I made my first mistake. Although looking back, I don't know if I really could have avoided it because, he's my brother, right? I told him yes, that he could stay in the guest room temporarily, but that it had to be something really temporary, like 2 months max. He swore and promised me that he was going to get a job fast, that he just needed that little push, that I was saving his life and he would never forget it. All very emotional and dramatic. You know how Ethan is. The first few weeks were more or less normal. Ethan slept in late, said he was looking for work online, ate my food, but well, he was my brother and I wasn't going to be stingy about that. The problem started around a month and a half in when he met Rachel. Rachel showed up one night when I got home from work and found her in my living room, watching Netflix with Ethan. Like nothing. Ethan introduced her to me all excited, saying she was his new girlfriend, and they'd met on a dating app. Rachel greeted me in a super casual way, like as if we'd known each other for years, and that same night she stayed over. Rachel was like 25 years old at that time, worked part-time at a coffee shop, but apparently wasn't very stable with work either. What I do remember clearly is that from the first moment, Rachel had this attitude of, I don't know how to explain it. Like a person who expects the world owes her something. She was one of those people who's always complaining about everything. That the weather is horrible, that her job is terrible, that her family doesn't understand her. Basically a professional victim, I guess. After that first night, Rachel basically became a permanent presence in my house. She didn't officially move in, but she was there literally every day, showered there, ate there, left her clothes thrown around in Ethan's room. I tried to talk to Ethan a couple times, like, hey bro, this was supposed to be temporary for just you, not for you and your girlfriend. But he always came out with how Rachel was going through a difficult time with her family and they just needed a little more time. Always a little more time. That was Ethan's favorite phrase. About 4 more months passed, and I was reaching my limit. Honestly, my house no longer felt like my house. There were their clothes everywhere. They never cleaned up their stuff. The utilities bill had gone up because Rachel showered like 3 times a day with hot water, and neither of them had stable jobs. Ethan had gotten a couple of temp gigs, but always lasted like 2 weeks before there was some drama, and he quit or got fired. I was starting to plan how to tell them they had to leave when Rachel gives me the news that she's pregnant. You can't imagine what that conversation was like. Rachel and Ethan sat me down in my own living room, like they were the homeowners, and Rachel announces with this huge smile that they're expecting a baby. Ethan was all excited, talking about how they were going to be the best parents in the world and how this baby was exactly what he needed to focus and mature. I could only think, perfect. Now they're never going to leave. But obviously I couldn't say that in that moment because who's heartless enough to kick out a pregnant woman and your brother who's going to be a dad? Things got weird after that. Rachel started acting like the house was hers, reorganizing things in the kitchen, telling me that this or that detergent was bad for the baby and I needed to buy organic products, basically giving me orders in my own house. I tried to keep my cool because, well, pregnancy hormones and all that, but the truth is I was getting more and more frustrated and resentful about the whole situation. About 2 months into the pregnancy, Ethan and Rachel announced they were getting married. It was a super small courthouse wedding. I went as a witness because, I'm his brother, but the whole experience was uncomfortable. Rachel's parents were there, looking at me in a weird way that I didn't understand at the time, but now makes complete sense. After the wedding, Rachel officially moved into my house, as if she hadn't been practically living there already. But now it was official, and they didn't even pretend it was temporary anymore. By this point, I had already talked to Ethan several times, each time more direct, telling him they needed to get their own place. That I understood it was difficult with the baby on the way, but this couldn't continue like this. He always told me yes, that they were already looking, that as soon as they saved up for the deposit they were going to leave. But months passed and nothing changed. Rachel wasn't working anymore because of the pregnancy. Ethan still had no stable job, and I was basically supporting 3 people with my salary, which, it wasn't exactly what I'd planned for my life. The moment that changed everything happened when Rachel was like 6 months pregnant. I had gotten home from work. It was a Friday and I was exhausted. It had been a horrible week. I walk into my house and find Rachel reorganizing the office I had set up, moving my stuff, my computer, my work files. I ask her what the hell she's doing and she tells me, all casual, that they're converting that room into the baby's room because obviously the baby needs its own space. I just stood there processing what I'd just heard. I told her that was my workspace, that I needed that office for my remote work. And she responds, and I remember this perfectly because it left me frozen, she tells me. Well, then you're going to have to work in your room or in the living room because my baby needs its own room and this is Ethan's house, so he decides. I was like, what? And I asked her what she just said about this being Ethan's house. She looked at me like I was an idiot and told me that obviously this was Ethan's house, that he had inherited it from his mom and that he'd been very generous letting me live there all this time. But now that he was going to be a father, they needed the space. Rachel kept talking, telling me they appreciated everything I'd done, helping with expenses, but now they needed me to give their family space. I was so in shock I didn't even know what to say. I asked her where Ethan was and she told me he'd gone to the store, all calm like she hadn't just tried to kick me out of my own house. When Ethan arrived about half an hour later, I was about to explode. I grabbed him and asked him directly if he had told Rachel this house was his. Ethan got all nervous, started stuttering and making up excuses, saying there had been a misunderstanding, that Rachel had misunderstood, but I already knew the truth. He had lied to his wife, made her believe he owned the house that I inherited from my mom, probably to look good in front of her, or to not admit he was living off his older brother's charity. Rachel heard the whole conversation, and her face went from confusion to fury. She looked at me and asked if it was true that the house was mine, not Ethan's. I told her yes, that I inherited this house from my mom 5 years ago, and I have all the papers that prove it. Rachel turned to Ethan and yelled at him if it was true, and Ethan, the coward, could only nod his head. Rachel exploded, started yelling at Ethan. How could he lie to her? How was it possible they'd been living there for months, and she thought it was his house? That he'd made her look like an idiot. And honestly, I thought, well, at least now she understands they have to leave. But no, Rachel didn't react in the logical way. Instead of feeling embarrassed and accepting they had to go, she got mad at me. Can you believe it? She told me I was a user for charging them, which for the record, I had never charged them a cent. Quite the inslo. That I was a bad brother for not helping Ethan in his time of need. Basically turned the whole situation around to make me look like the villain. Ethan didn't say anything, just stood there like always, letting others fight his battles. Rachel grabbed her stuff and went to her mom's house that same night, all dramatic, saying she couldn't be in such a toxic environment for her baby. I thought, perfect, let her go, and let Ethan go with her. But no, Ethan stayed. He told me he needed time to think, that Rachel was very upset because of hormones, that everything was going to calm down. I told him clearly that this was his perfect opportunity to leave with her, to look for their own place together. But he came out with how he didn't have money even for an apartment deposit, and besides, Rachel didn't want to talk to him at that moment. About a week passed with Ethan still in my house, in a super uncomfortable silence, practically not talking to each other. Rachel started, bombarding him with messages and calls, basically convinced him to go back with her but to her mom's house. I thought he was finally going to leave, that this nightmare was going to end. But then Ethan tells me that yes, he's going to leave, but technically, since he's lived there for more than 6 months, he has tenant rights, and I can't just kick him out like that. Can you believe it? My own brother threatening me with tenant rights in my own house. I was so angry, but I also knew he was right legally. I had researched a bit because I already had a feeling things were going to end up like this. I told him fine, that if he wanted to play like that, I was going to do things the legal way. I went to a lawyer, explained the whole situation to him, and he told me that indeed I needed to do a formal eviction process, even though Ethan had never paid rent because he had established residency there. It was frustrating, but it was what I had to do. I prepared all the eviction papers, formally, delivered them to Ethan, gave him the 2-week notice required by law. Ethan looked at me with this betrayed face, like I was the bad guy for evicting him when he was the one who lied to me, lived off my generosity for almost a year, let his wife try to kick me out of my own house, and then threatened with tenant rights. But that's how these people are. They always play the victim no matter how badly they've behaved. During those 2 weeks, Ethan was barely in the house. I think he stayed with Rachel at her mom's house most of the time. The day the eviction deadline was up, he came with Rachel and Rachel's mom, threw his stuff in garbage bags and boxes, all super dramatic, with Rachel crying and the mom glaring at me like I was the monster of the story. I didn't say anything, just stood there making sure they took all their stuff and didn't leave anything. When they finally left, I closed the door and felt this enormous relief, like I could finally breathe in my own house again. The following months were weird. I blocked Ethan on my phone because he kept sending me messages telling me I was a bad brother. How could I do this to him when he was going to be a father? Basically, more emotional manipulation. Some relatives called me, aunts and uncles and cousins, that Ethan had contacted with his version of events, where I was the ogre who threw a pregnant woman out on the street. I had to explain the truth to them several times, show them the inheritance papers, tell them about Ethan's lies, and some understood me, while others kept thinking I should have been more understanding with my brother. About a year later, I found out through a cousin that Rachel and Ethan's baby had been born, a girl. I also found out that Rachel had asked for a divorce when the baby was like 3 months old. Apparently, Ethan still couldn't get a stable job, and she got tired of supporting him. I don't know all the details, but basically Rachel went back to her mom's with the baby and left. Ethan, who from what I heard ended up living with his dad again. About 2 months ago, like a year and change after the eviction, I received a message from Ethan on Facebook because I hadn't blocked him there. It was this long emotional message about how he'd been reflecting, how he realized he'd made mistakes, how he missed me and wanted to rebuild our relationship. Up to there I was like, Well, maybe he finally matured. But then at the end of the message, he added if there was any possibility of letting him move back into the house just for a while he saved up money, that this time he really was going to do things right. I couldn't believe it. After everything that happened, all the lies, all the drama, Ethan really thought I was going to let him come back. I responded with a simple no, blocked him on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, basically on all social media where he could contact me. I also told my cousin, the only relative I'm still in contact with, that if Ethan asked her about me, not to give him any information. The truth is, I don't regret anything. I know there are people who think I was too harsh, that I should have given my brother more chances, that family is the most important thing and all that stuff. But I learned that there's a huge difference between helping someone and letting them take advantage of you. Ethan had months to get a job, to save, to look for his own place. Instead, he lied to me, let his wife try to kick me out of my house, threatened to use the law against me when I was the one who had helped him, and now wants to come back like nothing happened. My house is my space again now. I have my office back. There are no clothes thrown around everywhere. I don't have to worry about two other people's expenses. I can just exist in peace. The guest room that Ethan used is still there. Sometimes I think about converting it into a gym or something, but for now it's fine as it is. Every once in a while I wonder how my niece is doing, if I'll ever meet her. But that's probably never going to happen, and I guess that's okay. Not all family stories have happy endings where everyone forgives each other and hugs. Sometimes you just have to cut ties with toxic people no matter if they share your blood or not.